Hello, and welcome to this video about configuring Amazon AWS single sign-on with Microsoft Azure Active Directory. My name is Mohammed Haroon. If you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, please feel free to get in touch with me. This video is meant for intermediate to advanced users. At a minimum, you will need to have some working knowledge of Amazon AWS, Microsoft Azure AD, as well as some basic understanding of the single sign-on technology. In this exercise, we will go through the steps of creating an Azure AD, adding AWS as an AD application, creating an AWS identity provider, creating an AWS role, and configuring SAML token attributes in Azure AD to enable SSO. Finally, we will test our setup with a dummy user. So let's get started. Notice that we are in the classic Azure portal. This is because the AD configuration in the new portal is still in beta and currently does not support the advanced setup we will require for this exercise. Let's start by creating an Azure Active Directory. We will set this AD up with single sign-on to Amazon AWS. The goal is that once we have created this setup correctly, we should be able to assign or revoke access to AWS entirely from within Azure AD. Let's take a look how. As you can see, I'm simply creating an Azure AD. I'll name my Azure Active Directory Software Rockstar AD. Also, I'll choose Software Rockstar as the domain name. This will allow my AD to be accessible with the domain softwarerockstar.onmicrosoft.com. Later, if I choose to assign a custom top-level domain, Azure allows me to do that with some simple configuration. Once the AD has been created, we configure AWS as an application for this AD. To do that, let's click on Applications. Now let's add an application. Add application from the gallery. Let's search for AWS. We'll give our application a name. I'm going to simply call it AWS. Azure will set up AWS as an application that we will configure for SSO. Let's do that. Select Microsoft Azure AD single sign-on. Leave the defaults here. On this screen, we will download the federation metadata. This is a simple XML file that we will upload to AWS. In a different browser window, let's switch to AWS console. Here, we will need to look for IAM or Identity Access Management. We can either select it from our frequently used list or simply search for it. In IAM, we will create a new identity provider. The type of this provider is SAML. We can name our provider anything. I will use the name Azure AD. And this is where we upload the federation metadata file that we downloaded from Azure earlier. So now that our provider has been created, let's create a role. This is the role that will be used for anyone who logs on to AWS with Azure SSO. We can assign an AWS policy to this role for access to various AWS resources. For now, I won't do that. Here, we will create a name for our role. I will use Azure SSO, but you can use any custom name that suits your needs. Now that our role has been created, let's take a look at the details for this role. Here we have two vital pieces of information that we will have to enter into Azure configuration. The first of these is the role ARN, and the second one is the ARN of the trusted entity. Let's switch back to Azure. Let's check this box and carry on. This will continue to set up AWS application within Azure AD. On this screen, we specify the admin notification email for this application and we move forward. This completes the setup of AWS as an application within Azure. Now, we will go ahead and configure a couple of attributes for our AWS application. For this demo, I have already copied these attributes from AWS console to Notepad++. Let's create a role attribute. The name of this attribute is a constant value that looks like a URL. The value of this attribute consists of role ARN from AWS, followed by a comma, followed by the trusted entity ARN, again from AWS. Both of these values can be copied from the role screen in AWS. The next attribute we create maps the Azure username to AWS. Again, here the name of the attribute is a constant value that looks like a URL, and the value is simply a user principal name item from the drop-down list. This completes our Azure AWS SSO configuration. If we have done everything correctly, then we should be able to add a new user in Azure AD, and that user should be able to sign in to AWS from Azure Access Panel. Let's test that. Let's add Bart Simpson as a new AD user. Yep, I love Bart. Bart Simpson. Let's create a temporary password for Bart. I will copy this password to my clipboard because we will need it shortly to test Bart's login. So now let's assign Bart access to AWS application from within Azure AD. As you can see that currently Bart doesn't have access to AWS application. Let's fix that. Done. Let's log on to Azure Access Panel from a private browser window. First time log on, so I need to change my password. Okay, so now I'm logged on to Azure Access Panel and AWS, one of the apps that I have access to. Let's cross our fingers and click on the AWS icon. The SSO magic is happening. And ta-da! I'm logged on to AWS. All of our hard work has finally paid off. Now we can continue to add more users in our AD and grant and revoke their access to AWS entirely from within Azure.